The punch landed before anyone in the room saw it move. Not fast, not quick, gone. One moment his fist was at his hip, the next a grown man was stumbling backward, eyes wide, searching for what had just happened to him. The witnesses stood frozen. A few of them blinked as if their own eyes were lying. One man reportedly turned to the person beside him and asked, in complete seriousness, whether Bruce had actually thrown a punch at all. He had, from 1 inch away. And this wasn't a staged movie set. There were no camera tricks, no slow-motion replay to help anyone make sense of it. This was real. A room full of real people watching something that looked like it broke the rules of what a human body could do. The question is, how do you prepare for that? And more importantly, why would anyone bother? You've seen the movies. You think you know the story. You know the flying kicks, the yellow tracksuit, the scream that became a sound effect the whole world copied. You know the name, Bruce Lee, and you filed it somewhere in your mind between legend and icon and guy who was really, really fast. But here's what most people never stop to ask. Fast compared to what? Because Bruce Lee wasn't just training to be quick. He was obsessed, almost dangerously philosophically obsessed, with something much stranger and much deeper than speed. He was studying time itself. He kept notebooks, he ran experiments, he timed his own strikes with instruments borrowed from university labs. He corresponded with scientists. He didn't just want to move fast, he wanted to understand, at a fundamental level, why speed was possible at all. The action hero was quietly conducting a one-man scientific investigation into human potential. But what happened next, nobody talks about. To understand what Bruce Lee was chasing, you have to understand the world he was operating in and the very specific problem that was eating at him. It's the early 1960s, Los Angeles. Bruce Lee is not yet a star. He's a 20-something Chinese-American martial arts instructor running a small school out of a garage in Seattle, then later teaching in Oakland and LA. He has a reputation in martial arts circles, a buzzing, underground kind of reputation, the sort passed between practitioners in hushed, half-disbelieving tones. Have you seen what this kid can do? But Bruce himself isn't satisfied, not remotely. The martial arts world at that time was still largely divided into rigid, ancient schools. Each style had its forms, its rituals, its hierarchy. Wing Chun, karate, judo, kung fu in its dozens of flavors. And in that world, tradition was everything. You didn't question the master. You didn't blend styles. You didn't ask why. You simply practiced what had been handed down generation to generation for hundreds of years. Bruce Lee thought that was, to put it kindly, a catastrophic mistake. He had grown up training Wing Chun under the legendary Ip Man in Hong Kong, learning the style's central-line theory and economy of motion. The idea that the shortest path between 2 points wasn't just geometry, it was combat philosophy. But even as a teenager, Bruce was already pushing at the edges, questioning his teachers, getting into street fights in Hong Kong's Kowloon district to test what he was learning in real conditions. Here's the detail most people don't know. Ip Man purportedly told colleagues that of all the students he ever taught, Bruce Lee was the one he could never fully control. Not because Bruce was disrespectful, but because Bruce's mind simply refused to stop questioning. He was constitutionally incapable of accepting something just because it was old. By the time he arrived in America, he had begun building something new. He called it Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. And the name itself tells you everything about what was consuming him. Intercepting, not blocking, not countering, intercepting, which means acting before the attack has fully formed, which means reading your opponent's intention, processing it, and responding faster than the attack can arrive. To do that, you need to solve a very specific problem. You need to understand in precise mechanical and neurological terms what actually creates delay. What happens in the human body between the moment the brain sends a signal and the moment the fist moves? How long does that take? Can it be shortened? Can it be eliminated? These weren't casual questions for Bruce Lee. They were the central obsession of his adult life, and he pursued them with the rigor of a scientist and the passion of a man who felt the clock ticking. His challenger, in a sense, was physics itself.
The first real test came from an unexpected direction. In 1964, Bruce Lee attended the Long Beach International Karate Championships, one of the most important martial arts events in America at the time. Ed Parker, the legendary Hawaiian karate teacher who organized the event, had invited Bruce to give a demonstration, not to compete, to demonstrate, which in the martial arts hierarchy of 1964 was a meaningful distinction. It meant the organizers wanted to show the audience something unusual, something they'd never seen. Bruce walked out and performed a series of techniques, including what he called the one-inch punch. He asked for a volunteer from the audience, a young man named Bob Baker, to stand in front of him and hold a pad to his chest. From a distance of literally 1 inch, Bruce cocked his fist and fired. Baker flew backward into a chair placed several feet behind him. He later reported that the impact sent a shockwave through his chest that left him sore for days. The crowd went silent for a moment and then erupted. But it wasn't the applause that mattered to Bruce. It wasn't even the demonstration itself. What mattered was what the demonstration proved and what it forced his critics to confront. Because there were plenty of critics. The martial arts community in America in the 1960s had an uneasy relationship with Bruce Lee. Some admired him openly. Others resented him for his arrogance, they said, or his willingness to blend styles, or his insistence on challenging traditions that had survived centuries. And more than a few simply refused to believe what people reported seeing him do. A prominent instructor, his name has been left out of most accounts, perhaps out of diplomatic courtesy, reportedly told a mutual acquaintance that Bruce's reputation was showmanship, that his speed was exaggerated, that the people watching him were untrained observers or didn't know what they were actually seeing. This got back to Bruce, and here is where the obsession turned into something more personal. Bruce didn't just want to be fast, he now needed to be provably fast, measurably, undeniably. He wanted numbers, he wanted data, not because his ego demanded it, though he was certainly not a man without ego, but because the philosophy demanded it. Jeet Kune Do was built on the premise that martial arts should be scientific, evidence-based, stripped of mythology. If he was going to claim that speed could be trained and measured and optimized, he needed to actually measure it. He began carrying a notebook, what those close to him called his research notes. He started timing his strikes. He consulted with physicists at UCLA. He reached out to researchers studying human reaction time and neuromuscular response. He bought a device called an isometric strength trainer and modified it to measure explosive force output in fractions of a second. The people around him, his students, his friends, even his wife Linda, found this both impressive and slightly alarming. Linda Lee later wrote that there were nights when Bruce would be sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, scribbling calculations in his notebooks by lamplight, entirely unreachable, lost somewhere in the mathematics of motion. He wasn't practicing to get better, one of his students, Dan Inosanto, reportedly said. He was trying to understand something about time itself. The critics kept talking, the doubts kept circulating, and then he made his move. What happened next has been documented, filmed, and analyzed, and still, decades later, it makes researchers pause. Bruce Lee agreed to be tested, not by a journalist, not by a fan, by researchers using high-speed photography, the same technology being used at the time to study ballistic impacts in mechanical systems. The camera could capture events at speeds far beyond what the human eye could register, breaking motion down into intervals of milliseconds. The setup was simple. Bruce would stand in front of a target, at a distance designed to make the strike technically demanding. The cameras would run, he would punch, and they would measure, with the same precision applied to machines, exactly how fast a human being could move. The room was quiet, not the hushed, respectful quiet of a martial arts dojo, the cold, attentive quiet of a laboratory. Bruce stood still for a moment. Those who were present have described him in those seconds as almost unnervingly relaxed. Not the coiled spring tension you might expect, not the focused grimace of a weightlifter about to attempt a maximum lift. He looked, one observer said, like someone who was simply waiting, the way a cat waits, perfectly still, utterly available. And then he moved. The cameras captured what human eyes had been arguing about for years. His strike, from a state of complete stillness, landed in approximately 5 milliseconds. For reference, the average human blink takes between 150 and 400 milliseconds. A trained boxer's jab thrown from a fighting stance with a full windup typically registers between 40 and 60 milliseconds. A professional baseball pitcher's release, one of the fastest arm movements in professional sport, runs roughly 30 to 50 milliseconds. Bruce Lee's strike, from stillness, landed in 5. Let that number exist in the air for a moment. The researchers reviewed the footage. They reviewed it again. They checked the calibration of the equipment. The number held. What the cameras also captured, and this is the part that shifts the story from impressive to profound, was the mechanics of how he did it. There was no wind-up, no visible preparation, no telegraphing of intention. The power didn't come from a long arc of motion. It came from a precise, explosive sequence of muscle engagement that originated in his legs, traveled through his core, and arrived at his fist in a chain reaction so tightly coordinated that the body appeared, to the naked eye, to simply not move before impact occurred. This was not natural talent. This was the product of years of deliberate scientific practice, of Bruce Lee essentially reprogramming his own neuromuscular system, training his nervous system to fire in sequences that bypassed the normal delays of conscious movement. The physicist who reviewed the footage reportedly said, "If I hadn't seen the calibration myself, I would have assumed there was an equipment error. There was no equipment error. The people in that room, researchers, martial artists, skeptics, didn't cheer, they didn't applaud. There was, by multiple accounts, a period of complete, stunned silence." One of the researchers in his notes wrote a single sentence to describe what the camera had recorded. He called it movement without preparation. 3 words, but they contain an entire philosophy, because what Bruce Lee had done wasn't just punch quickly. He had trained himself to act without the pause that normally precedes action. He had eliminated, as completely as a human being has ever managed to eliminate, the gap between intention and execution. The critics who had called it showmanship had nothing left to say. The silence in that room said everything. He had measured greatness in milliseconds, and the milliseconds had answered. The footage didn't go everywhere at once. This wasn't the internet age. There was no viral moment, no clip shared 10 million times before breakfast. The results spread the way things spread in specialist communities in the 1960s, slowly, person to person, through letters and phone calls, and conversations in the back rooms of gyms and dojos. But when it spread, it hit hard. Ed Parker, who had known Bruce for years and had been his most prominent American advocate, later said that seeing the data confirmed didn't surprise him, but it silenced him in a way he hadn't expected. He had always believed what he'd seen with his own eyes. Seeing it quantified, reduced to numbers that a physicist had validated, turned belief into something harder and more permanent. After that, Parker said, there was no more argument possible. The argument was over. The instructor who had called Bruce's reputation showmanship, whatever his name, whatever his standing, was never recorded responding to the test results publicly. In the martial arts world, silence has a language. His spoke volumes. But perhaps the most striking reaction came from Bruce himself. He wasn't triumphant. He wasn't vindicated in the way you might expect a man to feel after years of being doubted. Those who were with him that day said he seemed, if anything, unsatisfied. Not dissatisfied, but unsatisfied in the particular way of a scientist who has just confirmed a hypothesis and immediately begun wondering about the next question. Linda Lee, in her memoir, recounted that Bruce came home that evening and went straight to his notebooks, not to record the results. He already knew the results. He went to write down what he still didn't understand, what the test had not answered, what the 5 milliseconds had raised rather than settled. He was always running towards something, she wrote, and the closer he got, the faster he ran. This moment, the test, the number, the silence, changed how the martial arts world related to Bruce Lee. Not immediately, not all at once, but it shifted something fundamental. It forced a conversation that the traditional schools had been avoiding for decades. Could classical training be measured? Could it be improved through scientific method rather than tradition alone? Was there a way to train the nervous system directly, rather than just repeating forms until they became reflex? These were questions Bruce had been asking for years. Now finally, he had data that forced the rest of the world to ask them too. And in a strange way, the most resistant voices, the traditionalists, the purists, the men who had built their identities around ancient lineages, became, in time, the people most affected by what he had proven. Because once you know that a human being can move in 5 milliseconds, you cannot unknow it. You cannot go back to accepting slower as inevitable. You cannot unsee the ceiling being raised. Bruce Lee had not just demonstrated a physical feat, he had expanded what human beings believed was possible for human beings. That is a different kind of victory, and it lasts longer than any trophy.
But here's the question that nobody who tells this story ever quite gets around to answering. Why did it matter so much to him? Not the speed specifically, but the measurement, the notebooks, the physics consultations, the high-speed cameras. Why, of all the things a young martial artist could be obsessed with, was Bruce Lee obsessed with proof? To understand that, you have to go back to Hong Kong, to a teenager who was, in the eyes of the world he was born into, deeply illegitimate. Bruce Lee was half Chinese, half German, the son of a Cantonese opera star and a Eurasian woman at a time when that mixed heritage made him an outsider in almost every room he entered. In Hong Kong, he was too Western. In America, he was too Asian. The martial arts establishment didn't want to teach him, not their secrets, not their depths, because he was an outsider, and outsiders didn't receive the full transmission. He was told, repeatedly and in various ways, that there were things he could not access, knowledge he could not possess, levels of mastery reserved for those who belonged. His response to that was not anger, or not only anger. His response was to build a system that didn't require belonging, a system based on observable, testable, repeatable truth. If something worked, it worked regardless of who your grandfather was. If something was fast, the camera didn't care about your bloodline. Science, he understood intuitively, was the one arena where outsiders could not be excluded by gatekeepers. Jeet Kune Do was not just a fighting style, it was an epistemology, a way of knowing that bypassed authority and went directly to evidence. He wrote in his notebooks, and this line is often quoted but rarely explained,
Use only that which works and take it from any place you can find it. That sounds like pragmatism, but it is, at its root, a statement about who gets to decide what's true. Not the master, not the lineage, not the tradition. The test decides. He also wrote something less famous but perhaps more revealing. The measure of a man is not in the speed of his fist. It is in the honesty with which he sees himself. Think about what that means in the context of everything he was doing. He was timing his own strikes, running his own experiments, comparing his results not to other martial artists, but to what was physically possible. He was holding himself to a standard that existed outside of human hierarchy and opinion. He was, in other words, refusing to let other people define the ceiling. There's a story, rarely told, that one of his students came to him frustrated with his own progress. The student was fast by any normal standard, faster than most people he would ever encounter. He wanted validation. He wanted Bruce to tell him he was doing well. Bruce instead handed him a stopwatch and told him to time himself. Then he told him exactly what the number meant, how far it was from the fastest documented human response, what that gap represented in biological terms, and what specific drills would begin to close it. The student was, initially, deflated. He had come looking for encouragement and received a physics lesson. But decades later, that student, who became one of the most accomplished martial artists of his generation, said that moment was the most important thing Bruce Lee ever gave him. Not the technique, not the inspiration, the number. The honest, unsparing, data-driven picture of exactly where he stood and exactly how far there was to go. He didn't measure you to diminish you, the student said. He measured you because he believed you could close the gap, and he had proof of that belief. He had closed it himself. That is the deeper truth behind the 5 milliseconds. The speed was the evidence. The real achievement was the willingness to look clearly at yourself, at reality, at the distance between what you are and what is possible, and refuse to look away. 60 years have passed since that room fell silent. In that time, the world Bruce Lee was operating in has changed beyond recognition. Martial arts have gone from fringe to mainstream, from ancient ritual to billion-dollar sport. Mixed martial arts, the direct philosophical descendant of what Bruce was building in those Oakland garages and LA living rooms, is now one of the most watched sports on earth. And if you talk to the athletes at its highest levels, the coaches who build champions, the biomechanics researchers who study human movement, you will find Bruce Lee's fingerprints everywhere, usually without his name being attached. The principle that combat effectiveness should be tested rather than assumed, that's the foundation of modern MMA. The idea that you can borrow effective techniques from any system, regardless of origin, that's how every elite fighter trains today. The belief that the nervous system can be deliberately trained to fire faster, that reaction time is not a fixed trait but a variable that responds to intelligent practice, that's now accepted sports science. He was ahead of the science by at least 20 years, in some areas more. But the legacy that matters, the one that extends beyond gyms and training halls and into the wider human conversation, is something less technical and more essential. Bruce Lee demonstrated with his body and his notebooks and his stopwatch that the distance between what you are and what you are capable of is not fixed. It is not determined by your bloodline or your tradition, or the opinion of the gatekeepers who stand between you and mastery. It is determined by the quality of your attention, the honesty of your self-assessment, and the willingness to keep closing the gap regardless of how far you have to run. That is a message that lands differently depending on who you are and where you're standing. If you are someone who has been told, by an institution, by a culture, by your own interior voice, that you are already at your limit, that what you've inherited is the ceiling rather than the floor, that the standards set by those above you are the standards you should aim for rather than surpass, Bruce Lee's story is a direct answer to that. Not as a motivational poster, not as an inspirational quote, as evidence. He took a world that told him he didn't belong and responded by building a different world, a world defined not by who you were, but by what was demonstrably true, and then he went out and lived inside that world so fully, so completely, that eventually everyone else had to acknowledge it existed. The 5 milliseconds matter because they're real, not invented, not embellished, documented, measured, reviewed, the real thing. And here's what the real thing asks of you. Not to be Bruce Lee, not to train for 15 years and punch through concrete. What it asks is simpler and harder at the same time. What is your 5 milliseconds? What is the precise, honest, measurable thing that you are capable of, that you have not yet tested against reality? What ceiling have you accepted that was never actually a ceiling, just the height of the room you happen to be standing in? Bruce Lee didn't just expand what the human body could do, he expanded what people believed was worth asking. He made it legitimate, necessary even, to measure yourself not against other people's standards, but against the outer edge of what is physically and mentally possible. And then he closed the gap. Again and again, at 5 in the morning with his notebooks, at 2 in the morning with his calculations, in every training session, every conversation, every film where he made the whole world stop and ask, "Did I just see that?" Yes, you did. And the reason you're still talking about it, the reason it still lands all these decades later, is that some things are true in a way that time can't dilute. 5 milliseconds, a room that went quiet, a man who refused to accept the ceiling. That story doesn't age. A room full of scientists and skeptics, holding their breath, watching a number on a screen that shouldn't have been possible. 5 milliseconds, and silence. That image has stayed with me. The idea that one person, working quietly, obsessively, in notebooks and garages and borrowed lab equipment, could accumulate enough honesty about themselves to produce a moment that left experts speechless. Not through luck, not through natural gifts alone, through the relentless, almost stubborn refusal to accept what he'd been told his limits were. If this story moved you, if something in it landed somewhere real, I'd genuinely love to know what you take from it. Not the speed necessarily, the principle underneath it. Here's the question I keep turning over. Bruce Lee measured himself against what was physically possible, not against other people. Most of us measure ourselves against other people. What would change for you, honestly, if you switched those two standards? Drop that in the comments. I'd actually love to read what comes up. If you're new here and this is the kind of thing that interests you, stories that go deeper than the surface version everyone already knows, then sticking around is worth your time. There's a lot more where this came from. And speaking of going deeper, the next story we're telling is one that almost nobody has connected to Bruce Lee before. It involves a conversation he had near the end of his life, a man he met who challenged not his speed, but his philosophy, a challenge he wasn't sure he could answer. I'll see you there.